Hello, this is Robert Rickover at Body Learning, and today my guest is Alice Riccardi. Alice is the co-owner and director of teachers at Portland Power Yoga in Portland, Maine. She's also a certified Baptiste Power Vinyasa yoga teacher. She's a certified Yoga Alliance teacher, and she's also an Alexander Technique teacher. And we're going to talk today about how the Alexander Technique, the ideas, the principles of the Alexander Technique, can be helpful to someone who's a yoga practitioner or indeed a yoga instructor. Alice, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here.
Well, I'm glad to have you on the show today. Could you begin, Alice, by giving our listeners just a very short description of the Alexander technique?
Yeah, absolutely. The Alexander technique really helps people to better understand the way the body and the mind were meant to work together to provide ease of movement and decrease nervous tension.
Right. And could we just go on from that before we get into more details? How, in general, is that going to be useful for people who are practicing or teaching yoga?
Very useful. A lot of people who come into yoga, of course, are brand new to yoga and may not have any relationship to understanding a kinesthetic feeling in their body. A lot of people come in who have a lot of knowledge of what we call yoga asana or poses,
Hmm.
but they don't really understand how their thinking can actually provide them with a deeper experience of the next stage of where they want to get to in their practice. So they're kind of caught. The beginners kind of don't know where to put their body parts. And
Hmm.
so the Alexander technique helps with that. It helps them to understand that there's a different kind of relationship that they can begin to discover. And then the more experienced practitioners can use the Alexander techniques or the discipline of the Alexander technique to then further deepen their practice and their understanding of their body. So it's a win-win situation for both beginners and more experienced students.
Hmm. And just to follow up on your point about kinesthetic feeling, and you said that often newcomers to yoga don't have that properly developed, I think you said, or something along those lines.
Correct, yeah.
Um, could I guess the obvious question someone doing yoga might ask, well, what exactly do you mean by that? I can feel what I'm doing. Um, what could be missing from that?
It's a good question. I kind of describe the kinesthetic sense as what allows us to be able to touch our nose with our eyes closed. So a lot of people think that understanding movement has to come from them specifically initiating it in a certain way, like I move my arm, as opposed to thinking other things that might help them to feel their arm moving, but not necessarily engage their thinking to move their arm in a certain way. So it starts to open up their availability to understand that kinesthetic is really about a feeling sense as well as thinking.
Hmm. And to hearken back, I guess, to one of F. Matthias Alexander's major discoveries, and he was the developer of the Alexander technique. In his own early experience, and I think it's fair to say in the early experience of just about anyone who studies the technique today, one of the things you discover is that what you feel you're doing may not have a lot of relationship to what you actually are doing.
Yes, it's very true. And a lot of the work that I do in class, not only in the larger classes that I teach, but in the smaller classes. One of the smaller classes I offer is actually called the Hands-On Laboratory, and it's confined, limited to 5 or less students. And one of the ways to get people to really understand that, of course, in the tradition of how Alexander lessons are presented, is actually to get my hands on them, to help them realize that there are certain ways that they've been doing the poses that have become habits.
Hmm.
Just like we develop habits in our everyday life in relationship to sitting and standing and walking and brushing our teeth, yoga practitioners develop sometimes very solidified habits in terms of what they think is the right quote unquote posture. And so they're end gaining as opposed to understanding. I mean, we're using Alexander terminology now. They're end gaining, trying to find a certain pose or a feeling in a pose, rather than understanding the means whereby, the process in which that pose may actually manifest over time. And so they begin to get more of a deeper sense of, through hands on and through proper instruction, how they can then proceed in regard to their asana or their yoga poses.
Hmm. So they can basically learn how to do those poses more in the spirit with from which those poses originated, I assume.
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly. Yoga was meant to be a study into, again, a deeper kinesthetic understanding,
Hmm.
what we might call the proprioceptive system, our body's ability to understand itself and movement in relationship to the space around us. And in yoga, we talk a lot about the energy or the source principle as helping with that understanding. I think Alexander would have called it gravity.
Hmm. Hmm.
Understanding how gravity works in regard to movement, and understanding how when we think through things in a specific way, we can connect with that, and it makes the movement so much easier, so much easier.
Yeah, and well, I have very little experience with yoga myself, but
Mm.
in general, that is one of the great benefits of taking Alexander technique lessons is that whatever you're doing, whether it's yoga or tai chi or, as you say, brushing your teeth or going for a walk or whatever, you learn that it's possible to do all those things a lot with less stress, a lot easier, and with less chance of injury, which brings me to another point, which is I have had students occasionally
Mm.
who have injured themselves in as part of their yoga
Mm.
practice. Could you talk a little bit about that, why that might be, and how the technique could help prevent that?
Certainly, there could be uh, two reasons that come to mind. One of them is that they're just pushing too hard. A lot of yoga today is quite vigorous, and a lot of people come into it wanting to get better at or getting better at it, and so they push a little bit too hard, and they go past the point of what is capable for their body, and of course they would injure themselves. That's number one. Number two is that they don't understand or have not been educated in regard to what in the Alexander technique we call the primary relationship, the head, the neck, and the torso, and how that works when we're thinking in an integrated fashion, how that opens us up into understanding how the rest of our body moves. And so when we can focus on that, there is actually a lot less chance for injury because we're working with a deeper sense of the core essence of how movement takes place. A lot of injury takes place, at least how I see it, because people are overworking the extremities and falling into the joint systems, the knees, the elbows, the hip sockets. And when we turn that around and we focus more on the integrated relationship of the neck, the head, and the back, and how that's first and foremost, it's amazing how many people begin to either recover from injury or totally eliminate injuries that they've had when they're working more with that particular focus, which is the Alexander technique in essence.
Yeah, and just to maybe help clarify that a little for listeners who are not familiar with the technique, that head neck upper torso or head neck back relationship that you're referring to, if you're not using that well, if for example, classically, if you tense or tighten your neck in order to do something like a yoga pose, you're not only going to be tightening your neck, but you're almost certainly going to be compressing your whole body in some way. And obviously, I would imagine that the basic ideas of yoga are to have an expansive body that can move freely and do whatever it does freely. So, in effect, you're kind of fighting the yoga process. Would you see it that way, or do you have a different take on that?
No, I think that's very well said and recognized very accurately. And classically speaking, if any of your listeners are familiar with yoga, there's a pose that many yogis do called down dog pose, and it's a upside down V shape in which people are resting on their hands and their feet. And classically, or what comes from a more classic style or a more traditional style, is that there's a lot of pushing at the base of the skull, and there's a lot of tension that's occurring through the neck and through the base of the skull, which in turn contracts and compresses the spine and the shoulder blades. And so a lot of yogis end up over time beginning to hate down dog
Mm-hmm.
as a result and need to avoid it. But with some simple adjustments and some understandings, as you're pointing out, of letting go of the neck, letting go of the pressure of the head on top of the spine, that expansive nature, that kind of what we call in the trade the stretch reflex, or the antagonistic pull of the muscles, just begins to happen naturally. And many yogis say, oh, well, that's so much easier, or that feels like I'm doing less. There's less effort involved. And that's what really exactly, as you stated, what we're after in yoga: the ease, the lightness, the freedom. And then we want to be able to bring that into our everyday life, because that's really what yoga is about, just as much as the Alexander technique is. How do we bring that ease into our everyday existence?
Mm-hmm. And do you think that part of the issue, or maybe related to the issues you've talked about before, is that yoga has been brought to the West from a culture, I assume the Indian subcontinent, basically, where maybe the original practitioners or people who developed it had in fact better use of their bodies to start with, maybe more flexibility than you see in the West. And so that when you take a system from one culture to another, you maybe there's some sort of retraining that has to take place for it to really be properly transferred.
Yes, exactly. And at Portland Power Yoga, we talk about that a lot, that Westerners, very different from Easterners, where yoga originated in India, in parts of the East. Certainly, there's a lot of different relationships to how they sit and stand. They squat a lot.
Mm-hmm.
There's a whole different array of relationship to the stimulus of life. And so, meaning, originally it was a lot easier in terms of what was happening in their environment. So here it's very different. People sit a lot. They do a lot of work at the computer. They're using a mouse, the more subtle or delicate bones of the wrists and the arms, and that can cause a lot of strain in people's shoulders. And so a lot of the traditional alignment, as you're saying, really does not apply to us in our Western culture at
Mm-hmm.
all.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And if we could just switch gears a little bit and talk to people who are yoga instructors, um, is it your experience? You've been at this for a number of years. Is it your experience that most yoga instructors are aware of the kind of issues we've been talking about?
Yes, there are some. There are some that are aware of that. I've have a handful of them that I've talked to about this, and they come to it after years and years of exploration and seeing people uh, injuring themselves or actually dropping out of their yoga discipline entirely because it just is not working for them physically,
Mm-hmm.
because they're developing so much strain and tension. as many people would do in their everyday life if they have some kind of activity that they repeat over and over again. I can say that it would benefit a lot of yoga instructors to explore the Alexander technique, maybe get some lessons. At our studio, I give the teachers lessons on a semi-regular basis so that they can really understand how it is happening for them in their bodies, in their experience, so that then they're able to explain it better to their students. I think it's a very, very useful tool.
Hmm. And it kind of relates to a point that one of my main Alexander teachers, Marjorie Barstow, used to
Mm.
talk about, which is that it's one thing to be an instructor of a particular skill, let's say swimming, or in what we're talking about today, yoga or piano or whatever. And it's another thing to be skilled at helping people to to Im- to improve their overall coordination,
Mm.
which is a bit what the Alexander technique is about. You wouldn't normally expect those two to be combined in one person. It would be a bit much to expect that. But on the other hand, if the person who is teaching the skill isn't at least sensitive to those coordination issues, it does, I from what I've seen, slow down the learning process, lead to some extra bumps in the road for students, maybe in some circumstances cause injuries, or maybe just cause people to drop out of the program.
Absolutely. There's a quote from the description of the hands-on laboratory that I teach that says, uh, the misunderstanding in association with body use is one of the main causes for loss of agility and hence injury. And also, if people are unaware of their body's own creative learning abilities, then we can actually become resistant to change
Hmm. Hmm.
because we get kind of stuck in this, well, I just don't know what to do next, and this is the way it's going to be. And so that kind of mindset actually begins to settle into the muscle tissue, the nervous system, and then creates a whole other issue of problems that relate to, I think, Alexander called aging.
Right, yeah. And I mean that ties in with one of the first things you said in the interview, which is that often one of the causes for injuries is people pushing
Yes.
hard.
Yep.
And of course, that's a very 21st, 20th century Western idea that to accomplish something, you have to work hard to do that.
Mm.
And of course, you do have to put some energy into learning a new skill, but to actually push hard with your body, no pain, no gain, probably isn't the best strategy for learning a skill like yoga.
No, absolutely
I would
not. It
think. I
really
mean,
isn't.
as an outsider, it just strikes me that probably is not the way to go.
No, it isn't. And when I'm teaching yoga, either in the larger class format or in the smaller class format, one of the major instructions for people or that I give to people is that they want to begin to use their thinking a little more actively.
Hmm.
Because a lot of times what happens is we learn something and then in the classic Alexander terminology, we kind of habituate into what we're doing. We kind of harden into almost a mechanistic way of moving from thinking that we're knowing what we're doing. And so I tell people slow down a little bit, begin to soften a little bit more through the base of the skull and just relax the neck a little bit. And they'll have to slow down. And 9 times out of 10, the student will say to me, but I really need to think in order to do that.
Hmm.
And I think that that's an interesting um, commentary on even where yoga has gotten to in this very modern day contemporary fast moving culture. That something that originally was meant to slow down the processing of the nervous system and help to integrate the nervous system into the body is now just contributing to the thing that we're trying to avoid, which is nervous tension and a sense of reactivity. And so it's interesting to see that really in the best way possible, the Alexander technique, if anything, gets people to slow down a little bit more and actually begin to think about what they're doing, which can only provide benefit.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Alice, is there anything that we haven't covered that you would like to mention before we bring the interview to an end?
One thing that I would like to cover is that in Alexander lessons, and now we're stepping away a little bit from the yoga world itself, but if people are interested in Alexander lessons and they do have Alexander lessons, what I'd like to say as an Alexander teacher is never underestimate the process of your lie downs.
Mm-hmm. Well,
And
yes, and just to explain what that's about, in a kind of a feature of most Alexander technique or many Alexander technique lessons, or a process that teachers encourage their students to do on their own, is to lie down on a firm surface, knees elevated, some support under your head, and there are all kinds of reasons why that's useful, which we don't really have time to go into today, but that is an extraordinarily powerful process. It may seem like you're doing nothing, and in some ways that's true, but you're encouraging all the right kind of releases in your body. Um,
yes,
and,
exactly.
yeah.
And that if people are practicing yoga, that they begin to slow down in that way too, that they begin to think a little bit more.
Hmm.
Not that they're not thinking to begin with, but to really engage in what it is that they're after in terms of the result of their yoga practice, and
Hmm.
just slow down a little bit and begin to be a little more interested in that process. And I think it will you will reap benefits from that. Even if you don't understand anything about the Alexander technique per se, just start there, and it
Hmm.
will be a tremendous opening into a whole new way of practicing your yoga.
Absolutely. The Alexander lying down process can be helpful for just about anybody if it's done well. You don't even have to have Alexander lessons to benefit from it.
I
Uh,
know, yes.
it's an incredibly powerful and simple, deceptively simple
Yes,
uh,
exactly.
process. And I guess one other thing we might want to just briefly touch on. Obviously, the majority of Alexander teachers are not yoga practitioners. If someone is a yoga practitioner or teacher or student of yoga, and they want to explore what we've been talking about, is should they worry if their teacher is knows nothing about yoga?
That's a very good question. No. I think that it's always good to find out what kind of educational background your teacher has. We always tell our students, ask lots of questions of
Sure.
your teachers,
Hmm.
know exactly what it is they're interested in terms of understanding or teaching alignment,
Hmm.
understanding how the body works. Do they have a basic background of knowledge about movement? Of
Hmm.
course, that's a good thing to know, but just enjoying the process and knowing that some good will come of it if you also engage in it personally. Like you will be able to get something from it if you don't just kind of blindly do exactly everything maybe that the teacher is asking you to do, but you slow down and listen to what's important in your body as well as what the teacher is asking.
Hmm. And I guess the analogy might be that most Alexander technique teachers are not musicians, but most of us do a lot of work with musicians. So I, I, I think that's you don't have to be your instructor doesn't have to know a lot about the specific activity you're doing to help you.
Yeah.
I guess that's kind of the bottom line, as long as they are, as you say, trained properly in the Alexander technique.
And
Yeah.
my teacher, maybe a final word, my teacher, Ted Diamond, says that not everybody does the Alexander technique, and there was a world that was here before the Alexander technique, and people seem to be working just
Mm-hmm.
fine before that. And so it's a choice, and it's a powerful choice to actually investigate it and find out for yourself. But you can also live a perfectly normal life uh, without it, you know. So I just want to make that clear as well.
Sure. Yeah. Well, if anything, I think on that note might be a good place to end the conversation. But if
Yeah.
anyone listening wants to explore the Alexander technique, uh, certainly if you live in Portland, Maine, or vicinity, we'll put a link to Alice's website there. And if you live anywhere else, we'll put a link to a site where you can find a teacher in your area and take a class, take a group class if that's available. Maybe do a little reading, do a little research on the web. You might find that the Alexander technique holds some pretty powerful benefits in store for you. Alice, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed talking with you.